Okay, let's unpack this. Think for a moment about a common reflex, something your body just does automatically. Throwing up.
Right. For most people, it's, well, unpleasant, sure.
Yeah.
Something you want to avoid.
But you deal with it. Now, imagine if that same totally natural thing triggered not just, discomfort, but this huge wave of panic.
Yeah, fear that's so intense it basically starts running your life.
Exactly. What you eat, where you go, how you live. So today we're going to dive into emetophobia. It's surprisingly common, but often kind of hidden.
And what's really key here, I think, is that it's specifically about vomit. But it's not simple. No,
No.
it's this overpowering anxiety. It can show up in different ways, like fear of yourself vomiting, fear of seeing others do it.
Or even just the possibility of being vomited on.
Precisely. It's got multiple facets, and the real-world impact is
Yeah.
significant.
Yeah. And look, for some of you listening, this might sound a bit unusual, but I bet for others this is hitting close to home. Our goal here, using research articles, various overviews, is to really get a handle on this elusive predicament, as some sources call it.
Yeah, to unpack how it can really affect daily life, but without getting bogged down in, super technical stuff.
We just want to connect the dots, make sense of it for you.
And if you look at the word itself, emetophobia, it kind of gives you a clue, right?
How so?
Well, emesis, that's Greek for the act of vomiting. And then phobia, obviously this intense, maybe irrational fear.
So right there in the name, it's telling you it's not just feeling a bit off. It's a deep fear response.
Absolutely. A powerful one.
And this fear, it goes way beyond just the physical act, doesn't it? The research shows people develop these major avoidance behaviors.
Oh, definitely. Actively steering clear of anything that even reminds them of it.
Including words, like common words people use every day.
Yeah, exactly. Like trying not to hear or say things like barf or puke or throwing up. It's like this constant mental filtering going on. And these strategies, this avoidance, you can have some pretty big, sometimes unexpected knock-on effects.
Like on physical health. That's one of the big things the sources mention.
Yes. It's not unusual for individuals with emetophobia to be underweight, sometimes even malnourished.
Malnourished. Just from the fear.
Because of the extremely strict diets and these very elaborate rituals they build around food, they're safety measures in their mind.
Right, right. So these rituals, you're talking about things like checking dates obsessively, washing food way more than needed.
Exactly, overcooking things.
Mhm.
Basically anything to reduce the perceived risk of getting sick from food, because that could lead to vomiting.
That sounds exhausting and incredibly consuming.
It is. And if you look beyond just food, the anxiety spreads out, into everyday life.
How so?
Well, the fear of encountering vomit or someone being sick in public, it makes people avoid loads of situations they see as threats.
Like social events, parties.
Especially ones with alcohol, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the perceived risk goes up. Or even just going out for a meal. Restaurants can feel risky. Being around kids, too, sometimes, because of germs.
Okay, and this is where it gets really tangled, right? The research connects this specific fear to other anxiety issues.
That's a really important point. It can definitely worsen or even sometimes be the root cause of things like social anxiety.
Fear of flying.
Fear of flying, definitely. Agoraphobia even, because the underlying driver is that fear of vomiting, maybe in public, maybe somewhere you feel trapped.
Wow. So it's like this one core fear just radiates outwards, creating this wider net of anxiety.
You got it. The worry about not having a quick escape, like getting to a bathroom fast enough or feeling stuck somewhere triggering,
Yeah.
it fuels those bigger anxiety patterns.
And that must just put huge limits on life.
Severely. It impacts relationships, work, school, just the ability to go after your goals, really.
And it's not just general situations either. The sources mention pregnancy specifically for women with emetophobia. That sounds incredibly tough.
Extremely challenging. The fear of morning sickness can be so intense that some women might delay getting pregnant or even avoid it altogether.
That really shows the power of this phobia interfering with huge life choices.
And if they do become pregnant, managing that constant anxiety around potential sickness is, well, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I can only imagine. This really underlines how deep this fear goes. What about travel?
That's another big one noted in the research. Avoiding travel is common. Worries about motion sickness, obviously, or maybe other people getting sick on a plane or train.
Right, and you mentioned restricted diets before. It sounds like that can get quite extreme too.
Yeah, often based on like a bad memory associated with a food or just this general feeling that lots of foods aren't safe. So the diet becomes very, very limited.
Even avoiding things like certain smells or sights.
Uh-huh. Anything that might even subconsciously link back to vomiting can become a trigger to avoid.
Okay, so let's dig into the origins a bit. What does the research actually say about how this develops? Is there like one main cause?
Well, the short answer is no. The research is pretty clear there isn't, a single definitive cause.
Okay.
But a really common theme is trauma. Traumatic experiences involving vomit.
The person themselves or seeing someone else?
Either. And often, these experiences happen in childhood. They leave this lasting negative mark.
That makes a lot of sense. A really strong negative association formed early on. And what about this idea of locus of control? I found that really interesting.
Ah, yes. Dr. Davidson's work on that is fascinating. It looks at how our sense of control plays into it.
So how does that work?
The idea is that people with emetophobia often have a stronger internal locus of control. They tend to believe they have a good amount of control over their lives, their health.
Okay.
So the act of vomiting, which is largely involuntary, unpredictable, becomes especially distressing for someone with that strong need for control. It feels like a total loss of it.
Ah, I get it. So someone who likes to be in charge, meticulously plans things, suddenly faces something completely out of their hands. That clash creates intense anxiety.
That's the theory. It potentially contributes to the fear becoming so intense. It's a really insightful angle.
And there were survey data too, right? Supporting the idea of past negative experiences.
Yeah, the Lipset survey, among others, many people with the phobia reported really severe vomiting episodes in childhood or witnessing others being violently ill as sort of the starting point.
Okay, so how does this anxiety actually look? How does it present itself?
Well, there's a whole spectrum, really. The research talks about reactions from, obvious distress, like crying, screaming when triggered, to more inward responses, like isolating yourself socially to just minimize any chance of encountering a trigger.
And in really bad cases.
In severe cases,
Good.
the anxiety can actually cause physical symptoms, like even fainting.
Wow. And the link with eating disorders, that seems really important to understand correctly.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Because we usually think of anorexia nervosa as being driven by body image concerns, right? But the sources point out cases where the main driver for restricting food isn't about weight. It's the fear of vomiting.
So they stop eating to avoid any possibility of throwing up.
Exactly. It's sometimes called atypical anorexia for that reason. The motivation is different.
Yeah.
And getting that distinction right is crucial for treatment.
That's a really vital nuance. And there's another related fear mentioned, sebophobia.
Yes, sebophobia, the fear of foodborne illness. That often goes hand in hand with the emetophobia.
And that fuels the food rituals we talked about, the washing, the cooking.
Precisely. It's all about trying to control any potential source of contamination that could lead to sickness and vomiting.
It sounds like this phobia can really mimic or overlap with other conditions. OCD was mentioned, obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Yes, Alan Wegg's observations highlight significant overlaps. You see similar patterns.
Like what?
Things like obsessive, intrusive thoughts about vomit, being hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant about potential triggers, using avoidance to manage the anxiety, developing compulsive rituals.
Like the food checking or hand washing.
Exactly. And other safety behaviors to try and reduce the perceived risk. There's so much overlap that, unfortunately, misdiagnosis can happen. Emetophobia mistaken for OCD, or the other way around.
So, with all that complexity, how do doctors or therapists actually identify it, and what help is out there?
Well, there are specific questionnaires clinicians can use, self-report ones,
Oh, yeah.
like this specific phobia of vomiting inventory, or the emetophobia questionnaire. They help gauge the specifics and the severity.
Okay.
And it's important to remember, while the intense fear might dip briefly if someone actually vomits, though many avoid that at all costs, it's the anticipation that keeps the phobia going, that constant fear of the next time.
That makes sense. It's the dread. What about medication? That seems complicated, too.
It really is, because, as we touched on, some people are terrified the anti-anxiety meds themselves might cause nausea.
Which is the very thing they fear most, a total paradox.
Exactly. But that said, some individuals do find certain medications helpful.
Yeah.
SSRIs, sometimes benzodiazepines, for managing the overall anxiety levels.
And maybe stomach meds.
Yes, some also report that certain gastrointestinal meds help, maybe by reducing physical sensations that they might otherwise interpret as a sign they're about to be sick.
Okay. And therapy-wise, CBT seems like a big one. Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes, CBT is definitely a primary approach.
Yeah.
It works on changing those negative thought patterns and the behaviors that go with them.
So helping people challenge those catastrophic thoughts about vomiting.
Right. And developing better ways to cope. Understanding triggers, learning to manage the anxiety response.
Exposure therapy also came up in the research. That sounds intense for this particular phobia.
It absolutely can be. And the sources stress doing it very carefully, very gradually to avoid making things worse, to avoid re-traumatization.
So what might that involve?
It can range. Maybe starting with just imagining scenarios involving vomit, looking at pictures, maybe videos, sometimes using hypnosis.
Or even inducing mild nausea in a safe setting.
In a very controlled, safe therapeutic setting, yes. Or exposure to cues, like smells or sounds linked to vomiting. But again, needs to be handled expertly.
Are there other therapies mentioned?
Yeah, things like systemic behavior therapy, psychodynamic approaches, general psychotherapy, they can also play a role, depending on the person and how their emetophobia presents.
Good to know there are different options because what works for one person.
Exactly. Especially with anxiety, finding the right fit is key.
And it was actually really helpful and I think destigmatizing to see that list of well-known people who've talked about having emetophobia.
Oh, definitely.
People like Joan Baez, Ashley Benson, Charlie Brooker, Denise Richards, Christina Pasitsky, Bella Ramsey, Matt Watson, Tuppence Middleton.
Right. Seeing that list really drives home that this isn't some incredibly rare, bizarre thing. It affects people, people in the public eye.
Yeah, it makes it feel less isolating, I imagine, for people going through it.
Absolutely. When public figures share these struggles, it chips away at the stigma and hopefully encourages others who might be suffering silently to actually seek some help.
Totally. So, okay, as we start to wrap this up, what are the absolute key things we should take away about emetophobia?
I think the main points are this is a serious, often debilitating anxiety disorder. It's way more than just not liking vomit.
Right.
It has a huge impact on daily life, diet, social stuff, travel, big life choices. We don't know the exact single cause, but trauma, especially in childhood, and maybe issues around control seem important.
And it often overlaps with other anxiety. Sometimes looks like eating disorders or OCD.
Correct. But importantly, there are ways to assess it properly, and there are effective treatments. CBT, exposure therapy, potentially medication. There's definitely hope and paths to getting better.
It really does show how a fear that seems quite specific on the surface can just ripple outwards and affect everything. So, for you listening, maybe some of this sounded familiar, maybe for yourself, or perhaps it gives you a bit more insight into someone you know. Just take a moment maybe to think about how powerful anxiety can be, how even a fear tied to a basic bodily function can really reshape someone's entire world.
And this deep dive has really only scratched the surface here.
Sure.
If this has piqued your interest, or if you think, hey, this might be me or someone I care about, please do look for more information. Reputable mental health organizations have great resources.
Definitely seek out support if you need it. And just to leave you with something to think about, here's a final thought.
Okay.
Considering how much we humans like control, predictability,
Right.
what does it really tell us about ourselves, about our psyche, when something so fundamental and uncontrollable like a bodily reflex becomes the source of such overwhelming fear? How does that deep need for control maybe shape our anxieties in ways we don't even realize?